Good afternoon, folks. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Okay. Looks like we've got everyone joined us now from the waiting room. Okay, so welcome. I'm Eric Klotchik. I'm director of the Hariri Institute here at Boston University. This is our first installment of the Did You Know You Could series for 2021. So happy New Year as well. And for the BU folks, welcome back. Our semester starting next week. So the Did You Know You Could series was pre-COVID, aimed to be a informal brown bag lunch sort of thing, sit around a large table, have someone come up, present cool ideas and new things they're doing for about 15 minutes, and then just sort of relax and jazz about it. We've had to kind of adapt a little with Zoom, but we're really working hard to keep the same sort of feel to it. The graduate student fellows from the Hariri Institute are the ones who are organizing this series, and I'm very grateful to them for doing so. The way we do this is we have the host is the person who's went through the idea of brainstorming and pulling in a great speaker and all that. So they'll actually then be sort of both host and moderator. So I'm going to introduce the host and then she's going to introduce the speaker and we're going to get going. Right, so our host today is Hassini Weerthun. She is a PhD student in biomed engineering. She was appointed a graduate student fellow at the Institute in 2020. She did her BS in engineering in Sri Lanka, where she majored in electronic and telecommunications engineering. She did work looking at screening of newborns via automated auditory brainstem responses. She now is a graduate student in Dr. Kara Stepp's lab. This is a sensor motor rehabilitation engineering lab here at BU. Her research is focusing on utilizing auditory and somatosensory motor perturbations of voice and speech to build models of speech motor control for motor speech disorders. So very cool work. And we're going to hear about other very cool stuff today as well, but Hassini is going to do the intro on that.
Thank you very much, Eric. As the host of today's event, I warmly welcome you all. The agenda for today includes an initial small icebreaker to get to know the audience we have today, and then we will proceed to the lightning talk by our guest speaker for today. And then we'll finally have a 20 minutes or so detailed discussion facilitating audience questions. So before I introduce our guest speaker for today, I want to start off with the icebreaker session. So I'd like to invite all of the attendees to use the Zoom chat option to indicate your field of study. For example, I'm from biomedical engineering and I study speech motor control, something small so that we sort of get a feel of who's there with us today. Awesome. At the same time as I'm waiting for the chats to roll in, I also have 2 poll questions for you. So I'd like all of our attendees to use the Zoom poll option to answer these questions anonymously. Today, as you all know, we are going to talk about conducting behavioral studies online. So my first question is, how familiar are you with Gorilla experimental platform? So let's take a minute to answer the poll. Awesome. Let's give several more seconds. Okay, so now we can end the poll. You can see the results. So we have a fairly divide of people who are quite familiar, but a lot of people who are not at all familiar with Gorilla. So this will be an interesting session for you. So my second and the last poll question for you all is that how likely are you to use Gorilla in your research studies? So the poll will go live now. Again, please use the Zoom poll options to answer anonymously. Yes. So remember, this will be a benchmarking poll that I'll be asking at the end of the talk as well. So we can sort of evaluate how well we did in getting you interested in Gorilla and online studies. All right. Yeah. So we see the results there. So we have 50% somewhat interested. So that's great. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for today. Kimberly Dahl is a PhD student in speech, language, and hearing sciences at Boston University, and she works under the mentorship of Professor Kara Stepp in Stepp Lab for Sensory Motor Rehabilitation Engineering. Kim received her master's degree in communication disorders at the University of Rhode Island and in linguistics at the University of Texas, Austin. She is a speech language pathologist who completed her clinical training in voice and swallowing disorders at Oregon Health and Science University. Kim is interested in understanding voice change in gender diverse individuals, listener perception of voice, and the assessment and treatment of voice disorders. Today, Kim will be talking about her experience in conducting behavioral experiments online using Gorilla Experimental Platform. And a note to the audience, we would like to request the audience to hold their questions until after the talk is over so that there's maximum opportunity for a discussion. So at the end of the talk, we'll set the raise hand options will be enabled, and the raise hand options will be disabled for the duration of the talk to avoid any interruptions. So Kim, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Asini. And thank you to the Hariri Institute for organizing the talk and everyone who's here. I see some lovely familiar faces out there. Let me start by sharing my screen. Great. I'm going to assume that everyone can see it unless someone tells me otherwise. So I'm happy to talk to everyone about my experience with Gorilla in this bizarre first semester of my PhD program. Gorilla allowed me to get a couple of studies up and running without ever setting foot in our lab. So I found it very useful. I'm going to talk about Gorilla from the perspective of running auditory perceptual experiments, but try to talk about it in as general terms as possible so that you can draw parallels to whatever kind of work it is that you do. And I will start by talking a little bit about the work that I do. So in these auditory perceptual experiments, what we're asking basically is what factors affect how listeners perceive the voices of others. And we've considered acoustic factors of a voice and how that affects the listener's perception of the speaker's gender, how characteristics of a listener affect how they perceive a speaker's gender, and more recently, how the quality of an audio signal affects how clinicians evaluate voice disorders. And it is in those two topics marked there that I currently have some studies in different stages of implementation in Gorilla. So what is the typical approach that we take to answering these questions? So we play some voice recordings to some listeners, and then we ask the listeners to either categorize that voice or perhaps to place a mark along a scale to rate that voice on some continuous variable. So I think you probably all hear this approach and think, well, yeah, that kind of does lend itself pretty well to online implementation. And we agreed, but there were some differences that we needed to be prepared for. So obviously, when we're doing these sorts of studies in our lab, we're controlling the environment. For auditory studies, we're using sound-treated booths, and we can eliminate or at least minimize the interruptions to our participants as they're completing the study tasks. Shifting that to online, now we have our participants joining us from their home, from their workplace, from some other location they've chosen. We're introducing background noise to the study, as well as a whole host of disruptors who will, in fact, join the study at some point. That is inevitable. In our labs, we're using high quality equipment. We're using the same equipment for each participant, and we have the option of testing that equipment during piloting and be reasonably assured that it's going to work for our study. That's not the case when you're shifting to online. So now we have our participants bringing their own equipment using a variety of headphones, devices, browsers. So it's going to vary across participants, and now we have sort of a higher risk of technical failure. With our in-person studies, we have more flexibility to sort of how we program the study. We typically use MATLAB in the Stepp Lab, and we can tailor both the interface that our participants are engaging with, as well as how the data is returned to us. Moving online, we're using Gorilla's interface. And while it allows for a lot of customization, we are working within their template. So there are some constraints there. And in my experience, there's been a little bit more cleaning of the data on the back end. So when we shift online, we certainly are ceding a little bit of control over our studies, but it's not just necessarily about what we lose or how we're limited, because there are some very definite advantages. So considering our participants, so when we're running a study in person, we have some limitations on who we can recruit. So we're limited by their location. They need to be within a reasonable distance to our lab. They need both the time to complete the study as well as to come to and from the lab. And then of course need access to transportation. Moving online, we now have opened up this flexibility for our participants, reduced their time commitment, eliminated transportation barriers, and what was of a particular advantage for our recent study, allowed us to recruit harder to reach participants. So for us, these were professionals, speech pathologists, laryngologists, who might otherwise not really been able to give up the time in their day to come into the lab. So that might be a benefit for the work that you do if you are trying to recruit these harder to reach participants. So maybe individuals with a particular diagnosis that is of relatively low prevalence, online studies can really help with that. So with that in mind, make that shift online. I want to talk through one example study. This was a study on the evaluation of voice disorders by expert voice clinicians, but the topic isn't really that important. Again, I'm going to try to talk through this study as generally as possible. And I'd like to touch on recruitment a little bit more, running the study session, the study tasks that were involved in our study, and then the lessons that I've learned. So recruiting for your study online, you can use a third-party recruiter. Some of the companies who offer those services are listed here. And to my knowledge, there is some integration with some of these companies with Gorilla, but we didn't go this route. We did our own recruitment. And so doing that, we could advertise as usual, but of course, expanding our reach. And we maintained in control of our screening processes, controlled our costs. We didn't really have to change any of that for our recruitment. But we did end up enrolling participants in just about every time zone in the US. Our study session. So you have some options for how you run your study sessions. You can run a completely unsupervised study, meaning that the participants access and complete the study without your being involved at that moment. And so you create the study, you share the link widely, and then individuals complete your study while you sort of sit back, kick up your feet, and just let the data roll in. It sounds very magical. And maybe it sounds like ceding a little bit too much control for you, but that's okay because you have other options. You can run a partially supervised study, and in Gorilla speak, this is what they call a supervised recruitment policy, but I'm calling it partially here, and that'll become clear in a moment. But with this setting, you can limit access to your study to those people who've been given an approved participant ID. So this lets you play a little bit of a gatekeeper role. You can keep your usual screening processes before you allow someone to access your study. But once they have that ID, they can go into your study and complete it on their own without you being further involved. So the final option, or at least that I'm aware of, which is the one that we chose, was a fully supervised study that we did through Zoom. Now, nobody needs an illustration of what a Zoom study session might look like, but I really liked this photo, so I'm including it. So fully supervised study, what we did is we scheduled a study session. The participant joined the Zoom session on the scheduled time and day. We talked through the study, what they were going to do, what to expect. And then once I knew that they were in the Gorilla study and could see the first screen, we both turned off our microphones and cameras, but remained in the Zoom call. And so then they went through and continued the study, but they could come back to the Zoom call at any point if they had a question or hit a snag along the way, some sort of technical issue, and we could figure that out together and get them continuing with the study. So this works really well for our study, and especially because we were recruiting those participants where to lose someone for a simple question or an easily resolved technical issue, that jeopardy was way too high for us because of our need to recruit these professionals. So this worked really well for resolving those potential issues. Okay, so what were the tasks for our study? So there were 4 tasks. All of them were done at once during the Zoom session. The last 3 we did in Gorilla. You can do consent in Gorilla, that's an option, but because we were already planning this fully supervised session, we chose to do it outside of Gorilla to keep it as close to our usual consent procedures as possible. So what we did was we reviewed the consent form together using screen sharing, and then both signed the document directly into REDCap. Again, Gorilla allows you to sort of redirect to external websites. So maybe that's an option that you would want to use if you were doing an unsupervised study. Once we did consent, then they began the Gorilla task. So it began with a questionnaire. This allowed us to sort of reconfirm eligibility, to re-ask those important screening questions, as well as to collect additional information of interest for our study. And then participants moved on to the sound screening. So sound screening may not be important for work that you're doing if it's more sort of a visual study, but there may be other screening tasks that you would want to include. For us, the sound screening achieves 3 purposes. It can test the autoplay functionality of your participant's browser. So if that setting needs to be changed, they're walked through that. It allows them to adjust their volume before they get into the study trials. And then it confirms that they're using headphones. Again, if that's important for your study, this is the time that you want to check that. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the sound screening. I first want to point out that we pulled our sound screening from open materials. There are several options for sound screenings there that can be customized for your study. And there are also a number of other common research tasks available in open materials. So definitely something to explore. Our screening began with the volume adjustment. So fairly straightforward. The participant played a clip, adjusted their volume to a comfortable level. For our volume adjustment, we included the white noise clip that comes with the open materials, but you can change that clip to something that if that's more suitable for your study. So for example, some researchers use a speech sample and require the participant to type in a word that they hear to sort of further check that the audio is working properly. They then move on to the headphone screening. There are different options for how to ensure your participants are using headphones. The one we chose, the participant heard a series of tones and then had to choose the quietest tone. You can see in the screenshot here, the instructions also allow them to play an example of the task before they move on. This was not actually part of our sound screening in the first study, and I regretted it. So this is something to think about for your work. Is there something you can include in the instructions to sort of really familiarize the participant with what they're about to do before they move into the trials? So once they are ready, they move into the sound screening where they hear the tones and they simply click which one is the quietest. We can talk more about how this works if people have questions in the Q&A. But once the participants got enough of these right, they moved on to the study task. So that's the last item in our study session, is the experimental task. I'm not going to go into detail about exactly what we did because it's very study specific, and I don't know that that would be terribly helpful for you. Instead, I wanted to talk through a little bit of some general tips that you might think about when you're building your study task. So some of these are going to be especially important if you're doing an unsupervised study. So using clear, concise instructions, and if you have lengthy instructions with a lot of text, maybe considering breaking them up on multiple screens, allowing your participants to sort of digest it a little bit at a time. Vigilance checks might be important for your work, especially if the study tasks are fairly boring or tedious or long, including these checks, which are meant to be basically impossible to fail tasks. So instructing the participant to type a 7 or having them click a red box or something like that. Very simple task, but that'll show up in your data that you can see the degree to which the participants were attending to the task throughout their time in the study. Do indicate your participants' progress. So you can have a progress bar, maybe a trial counter, something like that, so that they know what kind of progress they're making through the study. Again, these are especially important if your tasks are fairly tedious or repetitive. You would hate to lose a participant on the second to last trial when they finally threw up their hands and said, I can't listen to another I'm moving on. So let them know how much further they have to go. And you may want to debrief your participants. So again, because we did these fully supervised sessions, I had the opportunity to chat with the participants at the end and find out if anything didn't go very smoothly. If you're doing an unsupervised study, you might want to include a questionnaire at the end where participants can indicate if they had any technical issues, if they had questions that they didn't feel were fully answered, or their general impressions of the study. That might really help you improve later studies or get a sense of your participants' experience. These tips and many others come from some of the presenters at the Be Online conference, which I would encourage you to take a peek at some of those posted videos if you're just thinking of launching a gorilla study. I found them really useful to hear from other people's experience. And there may be some videos posted that it's more closely tied to the kind of research you do that would be worth reviewing. So some of the lessons that I learned from my first study in gorilla, I definitely want to share. So test and retest again and retest again. Do more piloting than you usually would because there are so many more factors that you can't control. So make sure you're testing various kinds of headphones and different browsers, different devices. See if you can you're never going to obviously be able to test every possible combination that your participants might be using for your study, but the more you can rule out that could be problematic, the better off you'll be. I will say for those who will be doing auditory perceptual studies, wireless headphones have been the bane of my existence for getting people through a sound screening. Use auto rejection with caution. So you can build your study so that based on a participant's answer to a certain question or performance on a certain task, they get kicked out of the study. And obviously there are going to be some very clear hard lines of whether or not somebody should be included, but I would encourage you to think about not outright rejecting them. So for example, if you're doing a supervised study, and they're auto-rejected, which was an aspect of the study that I did. It ended up being somewhat administratively tedious when they really didn't need to be rejected. And so what I'm doing for my next study is rather than them getting kicked out of the study, what they see is a message on the screen directing them to come back to the Zoom call and consult with me. And we can see if there's a small technical issue that we can resolve, or if they are in fact still eligible for the study. So something to consider. If you're doing an unsupervised study, maybe thinking about, rather than them getting kicked out of the study, that your data is flagged in a way that they can still complete the study, but you can decide whether or not that data should be included. And the last point that I put here is use time limits with caution as well. And I'm putting question marks on all these because I've just sort of started working with the time limits. It's not working exactly as I expected. And so it's something to keep in mind. So in our pilots who have been in a study with a time limit, I found that the time limit passed and they showed up as rejected for me, but then they continued on with the study and didn't learn until they finished that they had exceeded the time limit. So if you wanted to use the time limit as we did as a way of stopping a participant, that may not be the best option. But again, question marks here because I've just started using it and it's possible I'm doing it entirely wrong. So I've learned a lot in using Gorilla. I have a lot more to learn. And one thing that I want to mention to everyone, it's something that I want to explore, is coding and scripting in Gorilla. So if you are an experienced coder, this might be something that you would want to incorporate in your Gorilla study from the get-go. As a novice coder, I wasn't quite ready for that. And so I worked with Gorilla's templates and customizations, but you can definitely do a lot more in Gorilla if you incorporate some coding and scripting, and you can sort of regain some of that full customization and tailoring of the study that you might have had if you were running it in person through a different interface. Perfect timing. I heard that little ding there. So I just wanted to thank everyone at the STEP Lab for helping with this study, and of course our funders, and I will open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Kim. That was wonderful. So because this is sort of like a brown bag sort of environment, we encourage you to go ahead and ask questions. And because we have around 26 people, I think if you just unmute yourself and ask questions, that would also be fine.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for that. So I have a question. I thought it was interesting that, so we're thinking about, we'll be doing a survey, I should say. And right now we're thinking about accessibility for our population. So I was wondering about the survey component in the Gorilla interface and how that was for you, if it's as flexible, say something like RedCap. And also, I'm not sure if you know this, but we're interested in populations with reading difficulties. So we've been trying to think about how to include like potential audio options. And I was wondering if either of you knew about any accommodations like that that might be included.
That's an interesting question. So our survey was pretty basic, and it works a lot like other survey builders that I'm sure you're familiar with, like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or something like that. So very similar to those in terms of the types of questions that you can structure. And I didn't pursue any of like accessibility options, so I'm not sure about that. I will say if it's not something that can be created in Gorilla's questionnaire task, so there are different kinds of builders. There's questionnaire builder and there's a task builder. Mm-hmm. It might be more appropriate for you to use the task builder instead of a questionnaire, where you can have them play an audio file and then there could be a text box that they would respond to there. That's the first thing that comes to mind. It might be that the questionnaire builder also allows audio files, but it's not something that I looked into.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Kim. This was awesome.
Thanks.
So question for you. Can you just clarify in terms of like the supervised, non-supervised? So when you were doing this, you had sort of a Zoom window open and then they went through it. Is there any option that you know of where essentially you're in the room with them, like in the interface, if that makes sense? Well, like you're really watching the progress. Like I'm not sure that would be best for what you were doing, but was that sort of
you can. So, and I monitored them obsessively. So you can see exactly as they move from each point of your experiment to the next. You can also so it'll tell you what, if they're on the questionnaire, what tasks they're on, how much time they're spending on each. And you can also add checkpoints, which I didn't in my first study, but I've included that in the second one, so that if you were looking at your participant list, it would tell you, okay, this one's completed the questionnaire, this one's passed the sound screening, this one is on this task. So you can create what a sort of checkpoint is important to you. Okay. The only thing is the screen has to be refreshed for that to update. But yeah, I kind of would, especially with the sound screenings, because there was always a little bit of nervousness on my part when people were going into the sound screening about whether or not they would get past it. And so I was constantly sort of watching them move through and see if they got the rejection notice or the fail notice. But yeah, those are the ways that you can monitor them. Now, if you've got one sort of major task, It's not going to tell you where they are. It's not going to tell you exactly their progress.
Okay.
It's going to tell you that they're in that task and how long they've been in it. So that was one thing that I wish I could see, like exactly which trial they were on.
Okay.
But at least to my knowledge right now, you can't see that. So you could consider whether or not you might break up your task into smaller bits if that's important for you to see exactly how much they've done. That could be an option.
Awesome. Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, Kimberly. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
So yeah, I should probably be honest here. My name's Josh. I work for Gorilla, so put my card on the table.
You were the person who answered the poll as an expert in Gorilla, obviously.
Yeah, I was probably being a bit optimistic myself. So, but thank you. Wonderful presentation. I'm really glad that it worked out for you. One of the things I'd like to know, Ashley, is there anything that Gorilla couldn't do for you that you would like to see?
I actually think that last point that Liz just brought up, being able to see exactly where a participant was within a task would have been really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, definitely. I'm just making a quick note of that as well. Sorry. Yeah, absolutely. That comes up reasonably often, that kind of ability, and it's always a trade-off that we have within our experiment. I think we could probably think about putting something. One of the issues we have is that the payment structure of Gorilla is that you use one token when someone gets to the finish point. So we thought that was the best way to do it, because that means that if someone drops out of an experiment and you don't have data that you can use, you don't have to pay for it, which we thought was the fairest way to organize it. But it also means that we have to restrict people and stop you looking at the data until somebody hits the finish point. But I mean, it might be possible. We're actually developing Task Builder 2, Experiment Builder 2, which we're hoping to have out ready for the summer. And it's definitely something that we could try to. So which trial they're at, for example, that wouldn't tell you anything about the data. So that is something we could try and certainly integrate into new versions.
Yeah, and that's really what would be key for me, is not necessarily being able to see the data as it's coming in, but just knowing what trial they were at. For example, I had one participant who took about twice as long as the other participants, and kind of knowing, like, are they making steady progress, or did they leave the room? Did their kid come in? Because that definitely happened, you know? And so just if you could see that they were sort of sitting at one trial for a while, that would have let me know, okay, they maybe took a break or something like that.
No, that's great to know. Thank you.
I'm glad that you didn't chime in here to tell me all the things that I said wrong about Gorilla. So that's comforting.
Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Hey, nice presentation. This is a question maybe for you, but also maybe for Joshua, because he might know a little bit more. Is there any capability in Gorilla that you know of, or that Joshua knows of, about not only presenting audio samples, but recording audio samples?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Yes, so we do. Oh, there we go. So yeah, we do have an audio recording zone. It's one of our, we have what we call beta zones.
Okay.
And if you go onto our support documentation, then, and you look at the different task zones, then you'll see that there's an option. We call them the beta zones, and there's open beta and closed beta. Now, I think the audio recording zone might be under what we call the closed beta zones. Now, what this means is that anyone can access them. But we are still developing them. So we basically just, if you message the support desk and say, I'd like access to the audio recording zone, then we send you a default message saying that's absolutely fine, but here's a kind of a warning about using that audio recording zone and the kind of all the things that we've picked up along the way and the things that we're still working towards. But yeah, we definitely have that functionality. I know people are using it in their experiments, and it is working really well. There are just a few little tricks to the way that it works.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, any more information that you have about that would be great.
I'll ping a link into the chat for you.
Wonderful, thanks.
No problem.
I'm curious if anyone out there is already doing some gorilla studies, and if there have been any pearls of wisdom that you wanted to share to the group as well.
So I haven't started it, but I did start seeing if I could set one up using actually more of the coding aspect of it. Just playing around with a bunch of different things. But I will say it was there's templates that you can use if you're sort of doing different studies. Like I was looking if I could do like an A not B task. I was sort of playing around if I wanted to do something like that online. And there was templates that I could use, and then I could change that to specialize it for me. And I felt like with some general sort of coding knowledge, it was attainable, right? Like it was, it takes its own language, right, to learn like what the screens are, what this and that are. But I would say like don't be like super afraid if you have used like MATLAB or Python or anything, like you have enough to sort of translate to this environment. In my opinion, I feel like I was able to sort of pick up some of that. So I know you had mentioned sort of that going forward. So I would just say, give that a go, because I felt like once I sort of got the hang of the logic and the flow of it, it seemed pretty usable.
It was pretty excellent.
Yeah, also following, I was also curious based on Kim's question, there's a lot of people from different backgrounds joining us today. So how different, if you're using Gorilla or planning to use Gorilla, how different would be your screening tasks be for us, especially we're using speech and then listening tasks. So we'll do a hearing screening. What other aspects would you want to run your Gorilla experiments?
That's a great question. I was looking at the list of names because that's part of what I do directing the Institute, is trying to see where everyone's from. And it seems like you have a really rich opportunity here to kind of compare pros and cons and pain points and successes in terms of the different type of work you do. I'd be fascinated if you all would want to pick up on Hassini's plan. Is the silence that no one feels that they could move their stuff online, or they feel like they already did it? Or I'm just curious. It's not my area. Done a little bit of work with behavioral people, but not much. So from a computing and statistical perspective, I'm just sort of curious to hear sort of, how feasible would this be for the type of work you do to imitate something like Kimberly did?
I'm glad to break the silence. With just a little comment to say that I haven't started using Gorilla. I haven't started any remote data collection, but I'm definitely at that precipice of needing to start to figure out which approach I'm going to take, right? And so, Kim, I'm so thankful that you offered this today. It's helpful to get thinking, and I love having a group of people who are all auditory speech inclined. And the one thing I could say is that for me, I'm most interested in characterizing speech production in young children. So the question about audio recording from Saul was very helpful to get on point with, and maybe some others that I see here are also thinking about then how to capture visual aspects. So audio visual recording of speech is one thing I'd be curious anyone out here has approached yet in this sort of platform, because following masking guidelines is also not ideal for that topic of study.
Jen, I'm going to jump in here and say that we're piloting, well, I guess we're past the piloting stage, but we're collecting both audio and visual speech production data from minimally verbal kids with autism via Zoom. but I wanted to ask Josh, first of all, I'll say to Josh, thank you for sending the link, because now I can look at the audio recording zone page online, but it doesn't say what format the audio files are saved in, and that's a big question for us because Zoom doesn't have the capability of saving audio in a lossless format. And so we have this super kludgy workaround where we're having the parents like download an app on their phones, record the session, and then upload the recording to us, which is like, it makes my head explode. But you know, if there were another way to do it, it'd be so much more helpful.
Hi. So yeah, that's a great question. I'm afraid off the top of my head, it's somewhere in the back of my head, but it's not coming to me. And I'm making a note that we should actually have that on our documentation. Yes, I'm trying to remember now if I look at the audio zones, because I know we have recommendations on our audio zones of what format we recommend. It could very well just be MP3 that it saves as, but
Okay.
I can certainly check that out and get that added to our documentation.
We generally use WAV format because it's lossless, but on the other hand, it doesn't need to be really high sampling rate. For our acoustic analyses, we typically downsample to 16 kilohertz anyway. So I don't know if that makes a difference.
I think, yeah, it does come down a little bit with the audio recording zone. That, like I say, one of the issues is to do with the size of the packets and size of the audio file that you're recording. So one of the things we recommend with that audio recording zone is having a bit of a gap before the next trial starts, because that gives it time to upload the data that's been recorded locally onto the server. And having that little kind of gap to give upload time is one of the things that really helps out.
Oh, that's interesting. That's super helpful to know. Thank you.
Oh, no problem at all. And you mentioned about, we do as well have a video recording zone that's also one of our beta zones. So we recommend using Zoom if you need a dialogue, because at the moment we can record from webcams and we can play, there's the video feed and the video recording zone. Video recording zone, obviously recording the webcam. The video feed shows you what's been recorded by the webcam if you need to play back to somebody. But we don't have that kind of being able to project live video yet. So if you needed that kind of dialogue, then you would still need to use something like Zoom.
Okay, that's also good to know, because we have a PowerPoint and some videos that we show the child just for sort of resting state, facial movements. They basically just watch a YouTube video while we just collect facial movements. So.
Nice.
Karen, just out of curiosity, are you doing like free field recordings, or do you send them a microphone? Like, how are you sort of balancing that?
We're just doing free field recordings. And I mean, you know, it kind of is what it is. Similarly, you know, the light that we get is what it is. We're using we hope to use a program called Faceware to actually track the movements. But we're also negotiating with them a little bit so that we can get real world units, like actual millimeters of like lip aperture and things like that. And so like, you know, and we're talking with them about ways to use like a little calibration sticker that we stick on kids' foreheads, you know, for that reason. But so we're like about 75% of the way there. And I figure it's still worth collecting the data because we may still be able to do perceptual analyses, but it'd be so great for a lot of the reasons that Kim was saying, you know, to be able to access people who don't live nearby, and still get some data that we can acoustically and kinematically analyze too.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks.
So this reminds me of another question. This is for Kim. I know we've talked about in lab about the way the other end, sort of uploading audio for the participants to listen, and the formats that we have for that. Can you talk a bit about that? And I think there was another question about, does the platform have some audio enhancements, or if you have done, I know you were doing, some experiments to check that.
Yeah, I'll start with that. So we are trying to play the recordings from Gorilla in the sound booth and record it to see if they are still faithful to the recordings that we've uploaded, just to make sure that what our listeners are hearing has not been changed in any way. So we're still working through that to confirm. So I don't have an answer on that yet. But when I just sort of perceptually, when I'm piloting the study and listening to them through Gorilla, there's no perceptible difference to me between playing it through Gorilla and playing it, directly from the sound file. So, I'm hopeful that there's no real change there. But there was another question that you asked that I'm not sure I remember. Was there a first part to your question?
I think I wasn't sure whether the uploading capabilities were there for like the format. I know Joshua mentioned that the download version.
He can probably answer that. There is a recommended format that I did not abide by, and it worked just fine for me. I think the recommended format, and Josh can correct me, is maybe related to the autoplay, like maybe, or the different audio play zones.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is exactly that. So I believe, so we kind of recommend MP3 or OGG for our audio uploads. I think, like you say, other mediums work fine. I think there's always, the trade-off between kind of file size and, the ability, and you don't want stuttering or problems like that as you're going through. There are some issues as well, I should say, with autoplay, and this was something that all the internet browsers, we had the problem where you have 50 tabs, music's coming from one of them, and you can't figure out which it is. So a lot of Chrome, Firefox, all the big browsers came to an agreement that they were going to stop audio autoplay. Which is great for pretty much all situations, except when you want, or you're doing psychology experiments through a web browser and you need to automatically play audio. There are ways around it, and like I say, always feel free to contact the support desk at Gorilla, because we've got a couple tricks up our sleeve that can help make that more accurate, or they can certainly calculate if there's a discrepancy between the autoplay and if the autoplay takes time to start. So we have a few tricks up our sleeve. So yeah, feel free to contact the support desk about that. But yeah, I'm really glad to hear that it sounds like it was working fantastically well. And I love the idea of going to a sound booth and kind of playing it back to do a formal analysis. That sounds absolutely wonderful. I love the dedication.
Thanks. Yeah, I did end up using WAV files because, I saw the recommendation, it was related to the autoplay, but I ended up deciding just not to do the autoplay for hours. It wasn't necessary. And because my study task was actually quite long, so it was about 90 minutes of listening, I knew that they might want to step away for a break. And so I didn't want them to submit one and have it start and I wanted them to have a little bit more control of when the audio started. And so that worked for my study. Certainly there are plenty of studies where you want the autoplay, but yeah, worked fine without it for me.
Awesome. So we have time for one more question for Kim. I didn't realize time going on so fast.
Gabe keeps unmuting himself, so I think Gabe should be able to ask a question.
It might be off topic a little bit, given that the title of your talk is like how to use Gorilla. Did you consider other platforms, or have other people used other platforms and had success or failures, especially in the speech production type experiments?
I will say that I don't, when I came back to the lab, they were had already gone down the path of thinking about Gorilla. So I don't know if they considered others before deciding that. I don't know if Fassini knows, but so I don't have much more to contribute for that. Maybe others do.
Yeah, and I should just add here, I mean, it's not off topic at all. We definitely appreciate Josh joining us from Gorilla, but this is not a Gorilla sponsored event. This is simply a lunch series we hold at Hariri, and someone's talking about her experience with one platform.
I know I saw a presentation recently. Sorry, Hasini, did you?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Of a MATLAB platform that people were using for online experiments, but I don't know much about that. I don't know if there's anybody in the audience who does, but I was intrigued by that.
I can speak to that a little bit. I used it for songbird experiments. It was a custom MATLAB platform. I think all the code is on GitHub, but essentially how it works is it collects everything as a WAV file. So you're able to process it in any format, but I think there are versions of that code specifically for speech learning too. I can try and find them.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and adding to the question why our lab, Step Lab, actually started using Gorilla, we considered several platforms, but Gorilla was the platform at the time because we had a lot of issues concerning sharing participant data in an online server. So we wanted to make sure that it was a private server and all the encryption and all safeguards were there. So it was okay to share participant data even though they were de-identified. So I think that was one of the main reasons why we ended up using Gorilla. Okay, so I think we are sort of running out of time for our Did You Know You Could series for today. I'm really glad for everybody who joined, and thank you so much, Kim, for a wonderful presentation and sort of encouraging all of us to use Gorilla and using online platforms to conduct behavioral studies. I think it's really timely at this point for all of us doing behavioral research. We are a lot stressed about getting all the participants for our data studies. I think you all know that. And there's a lot of other events coming up in the spring semester by Harari Institute as well. If Eric wants to sort of, talk about it a bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Let me just first echo the thanks to Kimberly. That was great. And to all of you for jumping in. I was chatting in the back room with Catherine, who's the organizer of these events, and saying this is our best one. You are the group that has come the closest to feeling like we're sitting around together eating lunches with brown bags. So well done. We have a few more that we're going to run this semester. One will be on a topic in visualization. We're working with a colleague in COM to figure out just where we want to drill down on that. Another one will be working in the area of geospatial Earth systems and using Google Earth to do cool things. And we'll have another one about leveraging social media to promote your research. That'll be our own Gina Mantica, who you heard from just a few minutes ago, who's the Hariri Digital Communications Specialist. I also want to raise the idea that we are open to, in fact, we're eager to hear other ideas for these events. This is a new series this year. COVID made it challenging, just like your research and behavioral research is challenging. But I believe we're sort of finding our stride now. And I think that this is very much intended to help those of you who want to learn and find small communities like this here to do so. So if you have ideas, send them to myself or to Catherine or Gina, or just write to hicadmin@bu.edu, the Hariri Institute admin. Any of us will be happy to take the ideas and fold them into discussions as to what to do in the future. Okay, I think that's it then. Thank you all very much.
And if everyone just unmute and clap for us. Here we go. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
And thank you all for attending. Have a great day.
Thank you.